Hello and welcome to the third in our six-part series on democracy. I am Ruth Greenwood, the Director of the Election Law Clinic here at Harvard Law School, and I'm running this series along with co-hosts Professor Guy Uriel-Charles, Professor Lawrence Lessig, and Professor Nicholas Stephanopoulos. Today, we will discuss social media and democracy. Now, there are a lot of things in the world of democracy where I feel like the solution isn't hard, it's just hard to get there. But in this area, I will confess, I just don't know what the right answers are. Luckily for you, this session will be moderated by someone who is an expert in both democracy and all things cyber law, including social media, Professor Lawrence Lessig, the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership here at Harvard Law School. You all know how brilliant Professor Lessig is, so I'm not going to go through his bio. I'll just share that one of my personal favorite things about him is that unlike many academics, he is willing to put his ideas into action to try to make change in the real world through ambitious litigation, communications campaigns, and good old grassroots efforts. Professor Lessig will moderate the discussion today, and after the first 30 minutes or so, he'll be happy to take your questions. If you have a question, please just put it in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get to all of them. And I also wanted to note that for HLS students only, Professor Glenn Cohen is organizing the first of what will be a series of discussion groups directly after this event. So I'll put the sign up link in this chat. And if you are able to join for about an hour after the event, then you can discuss what gets discussed here with all of your peers. And just a reminder to everyone that this is being recorded and will later be available on the HLS YouTube channel. Okay, Professor Lessig and panelists, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And thank you to my colleagues for helping us put together this extraordinary series. As Ruth said, this is the third. And I agree with her, in some sense, the most difficult of the series we've had so far, maybe that we will have about how to think about the future of democracy. As Ruth mentioned, this is an area I've done some work in, and I need to, for full transparency, acknowledge up front that right now I'm serving as a pro bono counsel to Frances Haugen, who's the Facebook whistleblower. This is not a panel about Facebook. It's not a panel about the whistleblowing, and I'm not expecting any issue comes up, but I think it's important to make it clear before we get going. I also want to set the context a little bit by just reflecting on, at least for us old guys, which I'll count Nate in that, how weird this whole conversation is. When I was at Nate's school at Stanford, if we had had a panel about democracy, and we would have called it the internet, or maybe in the early days, cyberspace, it would have been an unambiguous celebration about the relationship between democracy and the potential that the internet was producing. Indeed, I left Stanford in 2009. The first internet president had been elected, and many people attributed the opportunity to motivate and rally people to the potential of that technology. It's hard to recover that sense of unambiguous good. And so I hope by the end of this conversation, we're going to have a sense of both the good and the risks, because this panel is actually going to give us a chance, I think, because of their background, to see as much of that as possible. These are famous people. Their bios are on the web. I'm not going to spend a lot of our time going extensively into the biographies, but we're going to go through a period where each of them gets to open up the conversation in the direction they want to open their conversation. I'll probably follow up by that on that. And Ruth, I'm hopeful that we can get to questions more quickly than 30 minutes, because I know there's a lot of people with a lot of questions out there. So I'm going to start by asking my friend Nate personally to open up. Nate is a professor at Stanford in the law school, but also super qualified with a PhD, and so spends most of his time these days trying to draw district lines, because he's one of the experts that's involved in redistricting around the world, but he's done around the United States, but he's done an extraordinary amount about social media and democracy. And welcome, Nate, and why don't you give us a couple minutes of your thoughts?
Thanks so much, and thanks, Eric, my co-panelists, for joining me on this. Thank you to all the folks at Harvard. And I think you're right, Larry, that yes, if we turn back the clock to when you were at Stanford, right, there was this notion that the internet was liberation technology, right, and that it was all upside. You had to think about the democratic potential of the internet. It was, supposedly going to be realized in places through, say, the Arab Spring and other kinds of dissident efforts to topple authoritarian regimes. And now that we have a much more dystopian view of what the internet means for a democracy. When I think about the impact that the internet and social media have on democracy, I think it's important to separate sort of three different categories of things. One is, what is it about our politics right now that is threatening democracy, even apart from the digital sphere? Issues of polarization, the decline of all kinds of legacy institutions, including legacy media, but also political parties and the like. And then second, what is it about the internet and digital technologies that uniquely threatens democracy? And then a third set of features which are unique to the particular platforms, Facebook and Google for the most part, but others as well. And I'll just say, to focus on that second bucket, which is what do digital technologies do to threaten democracy? I think there are a few things. That there's a family of characteristics of what I call velocity, virality, and volume, the speed at which information travels, the fact that it's done through viral peer-to-peer transfer, and the sheer amount of information that we have in our pockets. Let me just say something about virality, which is that a political system, a political communication system that privileges virality, privileges certain types of candidacies, strategies, and communication, those that appeal to outrage, those that appeal to emotion and the like. Second group of features of the internet is anonymity. The anonymous speakers are protected, constitutionally in their ability to speak anonymously. Publius, after all, was the framers' moniker for what they were doing in the Federalist Papers. But anonymity is what gives us, in many ways, the unaccountable speech problems, whether it's hate speech, whether it's bots, because it's becoming more difficult to distinguish between humans and machines that we're talking to and the like. So that is something that is uniquely amplified in the internet era, the ability of anonymous speakers to have a megaphone. Third set of characteristics are what is often called echo chambers, right, or filter bubbles. Your colleague Cass Sunstein's written quite a bit about this. I think that for the most part, where the literature is, where the social science is that most people online do not live in filter bubbles that are different than what they live in offline. That our experience for most people on the internet is maybe even more politically heterogeneous than our experience offline. But for a sizable minority of the population, that they do find themselves in these kind of cesspools of radicalization online, and that the affordances of these platforms that allow for certain type of, like, say, Facebook groups and the like, that's where you see the QAnon sort of conspiracies festering and the like. The last two things I'll say about the internet's unique features and its stresses on democracy are sovereignty, right? This was in one of the lack of sovereignty. This was one of the things that I think we thought would be liberating about the internet, breaking down national boundaries. But it's what allows Russian agents to have an impact on U.S. elections. It also means that U.S. technology companies end up having outsized influence over the democracies around the world. And that's the final point, which is monopoly, that Google and Facebook are simply different types of companies compared to any other media companies that pre-existed them. They have more power over the information ecosystem than probably any institution since the pre-Reformation Catholic Church, so that their algorithms and their content moderation policies are taking the form of law, something that when you wrote that code was law, really presaged a long time ago. And I think that's where we are in thinking about the impact that these digital technologies are having on democracy.
So that's extremely helpful in framing. I want to ask you a little bit more about the first brace of concepts. So you were talking about the way the technology amplifies, the way the technology enables anonymity, and the way it fuels echo chambers. I want to first ask you, among the three, do you have a sense of like the order of significance? Like what is the most significant of those three characteristics in producing the reality that we have today? And how would you characterize the problem with reality we have today? Like that's what's producing it, but what is the it that we're complaining about?
So I think virality is actually, of the three, the most threatening to democracy, but that it is also the thing. it is the most democratic feature of the internet, right? Which is that in some ways, the irony is it's the most democratic features of the internet that are threatening democracy itself. And so when we say virality, oh, look how terrible it is, look how how much outrageous stuff is and disinformation and hate speech gets virally transferred. Well, that's because we've eliminated essentially the monopoly position of the three white guys who were determining what was news at 5 or 6 p.m. every day, right? So of course there's positives and negatives to this. I often, when I give these talks, I often say at the beginning, that I get three criticisms. One is what I think is new is actually old, right? So people say, well, this happened with the printing press, this happened with television, this happened with radio. The second is what I think is bad is actually good. And of course, this is an example of that, where when you take away the legacy intermediaries, right, then you get bad and good stuff from the more democratizing impact of virality. And so I do think that if we could figure out how to sort of inject other kinds of intermediaries that would be able to be better able to police whether it's disinformation, incitement, or hate speech. But I think that the genie is sort of out of the bottle there, and it's very difficult. And that's why we've left so much of our, or dedicated so much effort to the firms, right? The rules that Facebook and Google have to apply. And so we turn to them for the answers because governments aren't really stepping up.
Okay, great. I want to shift to Tristan. When you're an old guy, you don't get many new friends, but Tristan is a new friend of mine. I've gotten to work with him extensively over the last year, and I'm an enormous admirer of what he's done. And he's not in the academic context. He comes from Google as an engineer, and then he left Google to start the Center for Humane Technology, and he's famous around the world for his participation in the film Social Dilemma. But he's been one of the most intense and engaged of the activists trying to figure out these questions and these policies. So Tristan, I think what Nate set up feeds directly into a focus that I know that you've been engaged in. So please take the floor.
Oh, well, thanks, Larry, for having me in those kind words, and really obviously honored to be with the co-panelists and here today. Maybe I'll just try to fill in from around where Nate was sharing. So just to say first, because we're obviously talking about all the benefits, there are many benefits to virality that can allow important ideas or marginalized communities to get their things out. I think there's also other ways for those things to get out. It's wonderful when Facebook groups can help connect people with rare diseases to meet each other and to find cures together and strategies that they can work on together. So I want to call out just those benefits. In the Social Dilemma, there's a line at the end where I think I say something like, it's confusing because it's simultaneous utopia and dystopia. There's wonderful benefits that we're getting, and there's these dystopian qualities. That often forces people to throw up their hands and say, well, then I guess we should just keep going with what we've got because we've got utopia and dystopia. The challenge and the reason why I will take the hard position that we don't just have a set of harms with social media, we have an incompatibility with social media's business model of virality, personalized virality, and democracy. I will make that strong statement that it is incompatible. And the way that I think we need to see that, we always start by saying the fundamental problem of humanity, E.O. Wilson said, is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And often that godlike technology is setting up new categories of philosophical discussion that we haven't even updated. So we're talking about free speech when we have an AI, a $1 trillion market cap AI pointed at your brain, designed to find the next perfect boogeyman to light up your lizard brain and your nervous system. That is not the same thing as what we used to call free speech when we're just hanging out talking in a town square. Obviously, we use concepts like free speech when we talk about scaled media. And so it's not as if we haven't used free speech to defend high broadcast media to millions of people in the past. But the founding fathers and those of you who've been thinking about it, especially in law, we didn't have such a thing as a $1 trillion behavior modification system that has more information on everyone's secret psychological patterns than they knew about themselves. That is simply a new phenomenon. And for a democracy to function, we know that we need high quality education. If the people are going to be bestowed with the power to vote, we need social solidarity, and we need a functional fourth estate. Social media breaks all of those things. It erodes education, the quality of education, because you can have great education in schools, but I'm basically dosing kids with a mental health problem for 5 hours a day, as we now know from the Facebook files. It erodes social solidarity because the outrage machine will pick the perfect thing that makes me upset about the other side to double down on my tribal in-group bias. That thing will always outcompete the other things. And so what that means is social media can't not polarize the population. Because no matter where you stand, if masks is your thing, if vaccines is your thing, if critical race theory is your thing, no matter what is your thing, it figures out the thing that either doubles down on your perspective or shows you why the other side is just wrong. And when you have a polarized population base, where the most incendiary thing goes viral for each of them and it draws them further into a corner, that base then has to be appealed to by a representative class who basically get elected by saying, yeah, this is why the other side is so evil and you should elect me. So in other words, it's slowly drawing us apart, and the basis of your unique selling proposition to get elected is to say how the other side is so evil and we should never compromise with them. And let me make that example concrete, because this actually happened with Frances Haugen's own testimony. We interviewed her for our podcast. And during the hearing, the 3-hour hearing, I've been working on this topic and the race to the bottom of the brainstem stuff for a long time. And in 8 years, I've never seen more bipartisan consensus than I saw her accomplish and create in that 3-hour testimony. It was remarkable. It was actually emotional. And there was a particular Republican senator who never comes down positively on these issues. And I saw him come down very positively on these issues. And then what happened? Frances was invited to meet with that senator. And then a story went viral. And you know what that story said? That she was a fake whistleblower, that she was a Democratic plant, and that she's funded by a billionaire, and that this is all a setup by the government to control and censor free speech. Now, why would that story go viral? That it's a psyop, that she's a fake whistleblower, that she's, a secret plant? Because that's an incendiary topic. And so now imagine that tribe that's sitting there waiting to be skeptical of this, that has some, they're not actively going to be skeptical, but if that hits their radar, boom, they're going to, jump ahead. And that story goes viral. And then that Republican senator that was going to meet with Frances the next day said, I can't meet with you. Why? Because this story had gone viral and my base won't like me for it. Now, for those who say that we've always had this in partisan television and media, and I'll just wrap this up because I know we're going to get to the rest of it, that partisanship predated social media, which is absolutely true. But increasingly, how much is Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow performing for his or her live audiences versus for the downstream engagement that they're going to get as their clips move downstream? In other words, increasingly, you have to appeal to the algorithm to get elected. You have to appeal to the algorithm to get attention. And so the algorithm has primacy over media, over news, over newspaper publishers, and over each of us. And it controls what we do. And if it's rewarding the worst instincts of our nature and the most divisive fault line in society, and you run society through that for 10 years, it is no surprise that you don't just get a broken, fragmented society, but one that cannot make democratic decisions in the face of incoming more crises, because we know we're living in a period of increasing climate issues and global instability and a whole bunch of other things. So as democracies fail to respond to those crises well, people lose faith in democracy and they turn towards authoritarianism. So that's the build that I would do, and we can get more into it later. Thanks, Larry.
Okay, that's a really great, strong line. Jamel, I hope it's not too extreme for you to be able to react against, because I'm hoping you're going to give us something to balance a little bit of Tristan. But Jamel is a professor of law at Columbia and has done much in the space of constitutional interpretation and constitutional theory, as well as a very strong connection to the technology sector. So you're a perfect cleanup for the other two who've now presented. Jamel?
Thank you, Larry, and thank you to my fellow panelists and to everyone listening. Yeah, I don't know how much of a rebuttal I would make to what Tristan said. I think a lot of what he's said is a lot of truth to it, and I'm not especially optimistic about the future of the relationship between social media and democracy. But I don't think it's nor do I take Tristan to think that it's sort of useless to fight against it. So I'll say just a little bit about who I am and what the oversight board is, and then make a couple of points about where, if anywhere, there are points of leverage into this conversation. So I'm co-chair of the board, the oversight board, which is this independent body that Facebook established that does a couple of things. So one is it sort of acts as a final appellate body for content moderation decisions on Facebook. I'll call it Facebook for purposes of the conversation. It's a little confusing when it's Facebook and when it's Meta. And so what that means is that users who've had their content removed from the platform can appeal to the board, or people who think that Facebook has not taken something down that it should take down and can also appeal to the board and try to get it taken down. The second role of the board is to make policy recommendations to Facebook. So the case decisions, which are published and open, are binding on Facebook. The policy recommendations have to be responded to, but they're not binding on the company. And we can offer policy recommendations in the context of individual cases or in the context of requests made by the company to the board. So right now, the board's handling a couple of broader policy requests, one relating to the privacy of residential addresses, and other relating to cross-check, which is the system where certain accounts and certain content receives additional layers of content review from humans within the company. So to the theme of today, obviously the decisions the platforms make, including Facebook, are enormously important to democratic self-governance for reasons that both Nate and Tristan have mentioned. I'll make just a couple of really three quick points of emphasis from the oversight board perspective. One is that I think the main mechanism for some leverage into improving platform performance along the lines of democratic governance revolves around transparency. So that's been a major focus of the board's interventions so far. So, tell users why what they're doing is wrong, tell them how they can fix it, make the community standards more clear, more accessible, make in broader range of languages, tell us more about how you interact with governments on takedown campaigns, audit the neutrality of the platform. So right now they've committed to doing an audit in Israel and Palestine, for example. So I'm sure that going forward, I think transparency will be an ever more important theme of discussion between the board and the company, including with this cross-check issue. On the theory that arbitrary decisions by platforms are sort of democratic threats that we can actually do something about. The second point that I think is really important for a U.S. audience and gets to the heart of some of the kind of tensions that both Nate and Tristan talked about here is that the paradigmatic threats to democracy are not the same across the world, right? So in the US, we think of them as sort of primarily, so certainly in these kinds of circles, right? We think of them as primarily sort of misinformation and disinformation, which I'll say something about in a moment. But in lots of other places, it's like coordinated harassment of regime opponents by authoritarian governments. The solutions to the problem of misinformation and the solutions to the problem of harassment are going to sit in very serious tension with each other, because governments can manipulate takedowns as a tool in their arsenal. The board had a case out of Russia potentially implicating these kinds of issues and encouraged Facebook to make some changes to their bullying and harassment policy, which it's pledged that it's going to do. But there's a lot more that one has to do in that area, and that's going to interfere with, if you think they should be doing sort of more takedowns, or that's going to be in tension with problems in other places. As to misinformation specifically, I think this is not a problem that the oversight board is currently especially well equipped to address. I don't think that's a limitation that's unique to the board, right? I think just we as a society just don't have good answers here. Defining misinformation and curbing its spread in ways that are consistent with free expression is a generational challenge. We like to be able to express ourselves often in ways that an algorithm would catch as misinformation if you calibrated it to do so. designing systems that sort of reliably take down misinformation is not the same thing as designing systems that reliably take down, human nipples or something. And as Nate says, it's symptomatic of the spread of misinformation on social media is just symptomatic of a larger problem that extends to cable news and lots of other places. I do think that over time, as we learn more about how Facebook operates in particular, the Oversight Board, I think, will have a bigger role to play in shaping policy here. But I think it's going to just take a lot of time to figure out what the best role for this kind of institution is and sort of substantively how to get this right. I think as I think about the board and the place it has in this kind of conversation, it's about trust and the need to create trusted institutions. This kind of, Nate talked about disintermediation and the lack of trusted intermediaries. And there's lots of good reasons not to trust, social media companies to police things like misinformation. There's lots of reasons not to trust governments to police things like misinformation. And so sort of building out trusted institutions that are able to do that is the challenge. I don't know if the Oversight Board is structured in the right way necessarily to be that kind of institution, but I think it's a good effort. And as we learn more about, what the challenge looks like, I think trying to figure out how to design, systems that are trustworthy, systems that have some accountability, but at the same time are not controlled by government or controlled by big business is going to be the challenge.
So that's extremely helpful. And it turns out Ruth was right about how quickly we're going to get to questions, but I want to follow up one follow-up question that kind of links what Nate was saying to what you were saying. One striking thing about the Facebook Oversight Board is it looks a lot like it looks like it addresses the sort of questions that the Supreme Court might have addressed when you were raising questions about particular kinds of speech. Is Nazis marching in Skokie okay? Is burning a flag or burning a cross okay? These are all questions about particular content and whether the line is drawn in the right way or not. But if Nate is right, and I know Tristan shares some of this view, that one part of the core problem here is the mechanism of virality, or the machine driving virality, not virality, but virality, then is the board actually the kind of entity that could be addressing it? And in particular, I know that Tristan's been pushing this idea in the One Click Safer campaign, and Frances Haugen testified about this in response to documents in the Facebook files that shows that Facebook themselves were able to say that if you just limited reshares of content to 2, you would have a massive effect on the spread of misinformation, like automatic reshares beyond 2. Reshares at 2 were 40% likely to be misinformation relative to any other reshare. And as those numbers go up, it's much higher level of misinformation. And so even just the technical intervention of saying automatic simple reshare, slowing it down in Nate's sense, might be enough to deal with the problem. Is that the sort of thing the Facebook Oversight Board can even think about, or is it sort of just too technical for the board?
Well, I think that you certainly put your finger on what I think the challenge will be in the evolution of the board over time. I think if 5 years from now, if all the board does is take individual cases and sort of decide whether the take-up was right, the takedown is right or not, then you're right. The board's not going to be able to do very much for these kinds of deeper issues. So I do think that the sources of law for the board, I should say, are not just Facebook's particular community standards, but also Facebook's values and also international human rights laws. The board has some role to play in trying to figure out how broader legal norms sort of apply to this kind of problem. And I think it's quite clear that the nature of the problem is different when you're talking about whether the neo-Nazis can march in front of Skokie is a very different problem than whether they can amplify their content with algorithmic precision to all their followers around the world. That legal norms have to take that into consideration, and the rules that a platform applies also has to take that into consideration. But just to the point on misinformation and how you could respond to it, I think this is I think it's clear that Facebook and Google and lots of other platforms could reduce the spread of misinformation with fairly straightforward technical interventions. The question is, what else would they affect? Right. So if you just limited reshares to 2, the question of what would be the broader societal impact of that? Getting more information about that, figuring more empirical information about those kinds of effects, I think will be really important to any entity that's engaged in trying to do policy reform here. I think the board can and eventually will be part of that effort, but it's going to be a process that just takes time to learn what you need to learn to do that with care.
Okay, so we're going to jump to questions, and this first one I'm going to give to Nate because it comes from a local friend and famous person in this story, Elliot Schrage, who was, of course, a senior executive at Facebook and recently stepped down from that position. His question is this, Nate. How would, he says each of you, but let's at least pick on the lawyers here. How would each of you revise or modify application of the United States First Amendment, assuming that the public platforms are public fora? Would you eliminate protections of anonymity, eliminate public figure protections, ? You're muted, Nate, sorry.
First of all, hello, Elliot. I see you have a lot more time to listen in on academic discussions than you were in your former job. Let me say, I wouldn't adjust those particular features that Elliot Schrage was talking about, anonymity and the like. I would chip away at Citizens United in terms of the rights of these social media monopolies, right? So I think that we need to have a rethinking about the First Amendment rights of, say, Facebook and Google, because I do worry that lots of regulations that I would propose and others could be seen as violating those corporations' First Amendment rights, and that's where I would change things. I think the users still have First Amendment rights that definitely need to be protected. I'm actually going to put into the chat here for everyone. I just finished a piece for a volume that I think both Larry and Jamel have chapters in that Lee Bollinger is editing with Jeff Stone, and this is on the constitutional status of social media platforms. So I'll leave it there.
Jamel, did you want to add to that?
So I guess the first thing I'd say is I'm not sure exactly how much First Amendment law would need to change to do the sorts of things that Nate's talking about. I think there's some uncertainty about exactly what the scope of a social media platform's First Amendment rights might be. I assume that they have some, but I guess if I were pushed on this question, and this is something I've talked about in larger writings, but I would encourage just more context sensitivity when it comes to the First Amendment, so that we care as much about what the government is trying to accomplish as about whose individual particular rights are challenged. So I think there are lots of perils in public regulation of platforms, but for example, a requirement that platforms have certain rules in place that they care about the responsibility that they have towards reducing the spread of misinformation or reducing hate speech or incitement, given the obvious risks of amplification and virality. But that leaves them some leeway to decide exactly how to implement that. I think there are plenty of people who would say that would violate the First Amendment. I think that that's I would wish that would be something that is at least on the table.
So Tristan, let me ask this brace of questions to you. The suggestion is that maybe the better way to think about this is as a privacy problem. So one question is, does the collection and exploitation of personal data by social media companies violate Americans' right to privacy? Another says, Shoshana Zuboff in the New York Times yesterday points to the power of data that Facebook and others have by extracting data without having gotten full informed consent. Might that be an avenue for regulation? Would you see like solving the privacy problem as sufficient to solving the problem that you're talking about here?
Sorry, I was finding the mute button. What I don't understand about the data protection way of going about this is that the whole premise of this is that users need to put their information in and know, Facebook needs to know what you click on to be able to provide things for you. So obviously, a user would want a company to have access to the basic information to tune information systems for them. So I don't really understand how that would really work. And I think Facebook and other technology companies really use the notion of privacy and consent to game it. It is another area where I think the medieval institution is not catching up with the actual system, that's not meant in any insulting way, just that the use of the law is being abused. Just to say something about the virality, there's a number of places where we know that Facebook has a solution like the one you mentioned of limiting virality after 2 shares, or limiting the number of group invitations people can make, or several things like this, but they were not adopted because they would actually impact growth. And there's a conflict of interest between what would be good for growth and what would be good for safety. And right now that's being adjudicated in what would be good for growth. And there's in any place, I don't know the legal mechanism to do this, but the immediate sort of tame the beast sort of set of solutions is to go back through their own research where they have a trade-off and they made it the sacrifice for growth instead of safety, and do the thing for safety. It's kind of like the, when Tylenol found that there was poison in the tablets and they didn't have a way of fixing the problem, they took it off the shelf until they could make it safe. I think we've now proven just how unsafe these things are around the world, especially in developing countries. And one thing people don't know about the virality is if you're in a country like Ethiopia or Myanmar, where actually there isn't a lot of organic content that's being posted, 30% of your newsfeed will be things that people reshared 20 times. So if you think about, your crazy aunt in the 90s who, when she sent you an email and it had forward, forward, for each of those forward colons of that chain letter, the more likely it was to be something crazy. But imagine that's 30% of your news in more of these emerging markets. This is how dangerous that this is. And this is literally, right now in Ethiopia, there's war going on, and there's many other places that are close to boiling. There used to be a joke at Facebook that if you want to know which countries are going to be in genocide 2 years from now, look at which ones have Facebook basics. So there's high stakes here. And there's some immediate things that can happen. I'm not an expert on the legal ways to make that happen, but I just wanted to add those thoughts.
Well, but I want to tie this to what you said at the very beginning, where you said, look, there's a certain business model here. And I wondered if it was a different business model, whether we'd be as concerned about the data. So, if they weren't leveraging the data for the particular purpose that you've identified, driving ads by driving engagement, or driving engagement to drive ads, would the data problem fall away? Like, is the core of the data, is the core of the business model?
Yeah, I would say the core is the business model in the sense that, when you work with the lawyer or a doctor or a therapist, you don't want to restrict the amount of data that they have. The idea is you give as much information to them, but because they're under a fiduciary responsibility to help you with as much of that information as possible. I think if you compare asymmetrically the amount of data that we're handing to a big technology company that's reliant on data, so long as that business model is advertising, it's as if you're walking into the lawyer's office and their job is to manipulate you using all that information that's asymmetric to you, where they have an entangled relationship and ability to determine major life consequences for you. I would say that it's actually about the business model, and it'd be fine to have Facebook be in a role where it collects all that data, but then there's some kind of public social responsibility use of that information. And there's some kind of board that's like, what are the best ways that we can enhance people's lives positively? And there's again, an oversight process that's not just 20-year-old tech bros thinking about what public benefit looks like, but a genuine sensibility about how do we use this information to be the best service. What we need to also do is decouple engagement from business success, because so long as engagement is necessary, all of the addiction aspects are also built in. And we can't have a brain implant in a patient whose job is to give you an addiction, because that would just be a crazy business model. Imagine if Neuralink was put into your brain and Elon Musk had a business model based on advertising. So it wasn't just that your thoughts would go to the ads in your mind, your own thoughts would go to advertising. It's that you would be incentivized to pull your whole mind into a certain direction constantly enough that brain implant would have to drive you in a direction. It couldn't just be sitting there waiting to when it was beneficial to you. The actual beneficial kind of technology that's fiduciary to us has to be waiting patiently, like a tool, as I said, in the social dilemma, that's of service to us, not where we are the product to it.
So can I just jump in with one thing here on the very quickly, which is just that, and this amplifies the point about what's happening around the world, particularly in conflict zones. So there's one set of issues that deals with the power of the algorithm as well as maybe targeted ads, as you were saying, and how that leads to polarization and the like. But if you talk to folks around the world, right, the problem they see is WhatsApp more than it is Facebook, right? And WhatsApp does not have ads, and it does not have an algorithm. The virality problem is still there, and they have the big problems of both disinformation, hate speech, incitement, and the like, and through organization on that platform. And so in some ways, this is even bigger. We should still do all the things. And I think transparency on the data side is obviously something that's been my hobby worse. But when you look at these peer-to-peer messaging platforms and you see what's happening there, and mind you, WhatsApp has tried to introduce friction to decrease virality, but you still see sophisticated actors exploiting it in order to get this stuff out there. And nevertheless, that isn't really an algorithm or advertising.
Yeah, I wanted to insert, and then I wanted to follow up with a question to you, Nate. So when you were talking about like what would be the right way for the companies to be thinking about these data, I know that in other contexts you've pointed to our colleague John Zittrain's work around creating a certain fiduciary relationship with users. That's what a lawyer has with their clients. And if they have a fiduciary relationship, then they would have to act in ways that advance the interests of the user when it conflicted with their own interests. And that could be a compensating regime to balance the built-in conflict here. But Nate, I wonder, one question we have here is, and I want to ask this of you because you, I think of all of us, have had real practical experience in implementation of policy. You're doing a lot of it in the context of redistricting, but your range of experience with data and governments helps you think about this, I think, in a useful way. The question is, are new and reimagined governmental agencies and regulatory models needed to address the disruption caused by the digital transformation of society? Can we expect new laws to regulate technology in the internet age will effectively remedy the problem? Do you imagine the FCC stepping in here, or the FTC? I mean, what would you, if you could craft whatever you want to build?
Well, I've proposed a piece of legislation when I was testifying in the Senate a week or two ago called the Platform Transparency and Accountability Act. If people are interested, it's at the top of my Twitter feed, which is @personally. And it empowers the FTC to have greater power to force the social media platforms to reveal some of their data for outside scrutiny, independent researchers. And so I sort of feel we should have a digital services agency. There are enough issues that are coming up that we need a cabinet level position like this. That's what the Europeans are sort of doing. But we've got to go to war with the government that we have. To spend 5 years developing a new cabinet department, I think, is not the best use of our time. But since the FTC deals with privacy, has dealt with the consent decrees with the platforms, has sort of the tightest relationship when it comes to whether it's antitrust or privacy and the like, or fraud, I would vest them with more of this power.
Okay, and then a question for Jamel. So if big tech companies are monopolies operating in a quasi-sovereign way, to what extent are they effectively government actors for purposes of privacy, search and seizure with respect to actions in foreign countries? And I think this must be something you've reflected on as you've been asked to serve on a board that's reviewing a company that touches 3 billion people's lives every month. So, do you discipline yourself to think I'm not actually a quasi-government, or we're not evaluating a quasi-government, or does it feel like you are reviewing or limiting or thinking about how to limit what is in effect a government for these people who participate?
So I guess I'd say that I don't find it especially all that helpful. And for this volume that Nate referred to, this Lee Bollinger and Jeff Stone edited volume, I talk about this a little bit. I don't find it especially helpful to maintain a government analogy insofar as there are lots of different things that governments do. And I think that we should think about those things in very different ways, right? So governments also host platforms of various kinds and host forums of various kinds, and we should think differently about the ways in which they regulate when they're engaged in that kind of activity than if they're detaining people, arresting them, stopping them from living their lives. and so forth. Likewise with social media platforms, I think there are ways in which they exceed the reach of governments, and there are ways in which the things they do paradigmatically are a lighter touch than what governments do, right? So they are broader, they affect more people, they can amplify speech in ways that governments can't. They can control the media environment in ways that governments often can't. But at the same time, right, they're not putting people in prison. They're not smashing anyone's knuckles, right? They're not coercing people. There is Facebook jail, right? But that's a little bit different than real jail, and different and important ways that we should care about when we think about how to regulate here, right? So I like to be sort of contextual all the way down. So contextual in the way we think about what governments do, and also contextual in the way that we think about what platforms do. As a matter of law, right, in the law in the United States, the fact that social media, that a Google or a Facebook might be, very, very big, does not make them like governments. We still maintain a private-public divide in a somewhat formalistic way. There are other countries that don't do that, and that think of much of South America, for example. The legal regime doesn't draw that strong a distinction between public and private in that sense. And I think that there are good. I think one has to pay attention to what context we're talking about. So what is it that they're doing? How important is what they're doing? They've committed themselves, by the way, all of these companies, to the UN guiding principle, the big ones, the UN guiding principles of business and human rights, right? So to some degree, they've committed themselves to being governed by a legal regime, right? So that there are ways of developing norms that will apply to these companies. But I think, again, we have to be very sensitive to what the particular context is.
Well, but just to push a little bit on that. So one thing we're concerned about in the context of companies like this is their connection to government. And especially in developing nations where this is the dominant platform for personalized news or even news itself, the platform becomes extremely powerful as a way to advance the purposes, even genocidal purposes of a government. Does that suggest that we ought to be worried in the way a federalist structure would be worried to break up power enough so that the platform can't leverage its control over governments, if not in countries like the United States, at least in many of these countries where the platform is so dominant?
What I'll say is that I think that the degree of control that a platform has over the information ecosystem should, in my view, be relevant to how we develop the standards that, the legal standards that apply to them, right? So when we talk about international human rights law and the commitment that companies have made to that law, I think market dominance is a really important factor there. As to whether that means they should be broken up, as someone who's just not a competition expert, I'm hesitant to talk about that, and I certainly haven't. As the Oversight Board is certainly agnostic on that question, right? So I don't know is the short answer.
Nate, does breakup help solve the problems, or is it orthogonal to the problems we're talking about?
Well, it depends which problem you're talking about. So breakup deals with some problems for the size of these firms. But if the problem is the power of, say, the Google search algorithm, right, the fact that everybody is using it, or the problem is the Facebook newsfeed, you can't break up those two things, right? So yes, you could sever off WhatsApp and Instagram from Facebook, and then maybe it will sort of split the amount of attention that any given group has. But you still are going to have many of these problems that we're talking about that are posed from virality, et cetera. I do think, and this was one of the other questions that came in the chat about thinking about interoperability and the importance of trying to get more competition in the social media space. So there are some ideas, and Frank Fukuyama at our shop at Stanford has written along with Barack Richmond, who I see has joined us, it has written a piece on interoperability and trying to promote greater competition. So I think that's good in and of itself. But to some extent, the consolidation of power of these companies is emblematic of a larger sort of set of problems of large companies and consolidation, their threats to democracy. When it comes to the regulation of the communication environment, I actually don't think breaking them up is going to solve many of the problems that we're talking about. It still might be a good idea to do it for other reasons.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's important to recognize there are ways to effectively break up the news feed, right? If you made data perfectly transportable and you allowed other companies to easily bring people in, then you could create competition. But that competition doesn't necessarily solve the problem that Tristan's talking about, because that could just be more people trying to engage in this mind manipulation than more effectively than Facebook does. But Tristan, I want to transition this to a question I know you've spoken about a lot. Nate nicely pointed to, 25 years ago, me thinking about the way code is law. That slogan I've found has three kinds of reactions. The most common reaction is, huh? And then there's the reaction of, oh my God, no, we can't imagine code is law. And then there's a kind of, oh, that's cool, code is law. And this question feeds, I think, off of the third reaction. The question is, China has said it would like to lead the world in technology innovation, artificial intelligence, 5G, et cetera. How do you balance the need to regulate and control companies like Facebook with the need to support technology companies in the United States to further our own national security interests, especially when the strategies for dealing with code here are so radically different?
Yeah, and talk about runaway power. This is one of the things that Facebook's lobbyists and Google's lobbyists will often point to is don't regulate us because then the US will fall behind in the global race for technology with China. The problem is that Facebook's business model is directly weakening the United States against that geopolitical competition with China. If you slow the gears and you throw a wrench in democracy, you shatter shared reality forever so that there is no common ground and no social solidarity with our fellow countrymen and women. And the gears of democracy are broken because people are elected based on going more divisive. I forgot to mention that last part in my opening comments, that in the Facebook files that Francis pointed out, when Facebook changed the algorithm towards more meaningful social interaction, aka more arguments and engagement, it actually forced political parties throughout Europe to go more divisive, meaning that they actually only got attention. They didn't want to appeal to the algorithm to say, hey, let's go divisive and just say negative things about our opponents. But that's the only thing that allowed them to get the attention to get elected, which shows that the algorithm has primacy on how democracies around the world work. And if the basis of getting elected is go more divisive and disagree with the other side to a degree that is, basically breaks the gears of any kind of consensus or deliberation or compromise, then you're basically breaking democracy in the face of that geopolitical competition with China. And essentially, democracy plus tech, in the same way that the printing press broke feudalism and enabled democracy, AI-powered behavior modification machines personalized with the perfect boogeyman for you, I think breaks democracy and actually creates new conditions in which authoritarianism simply evolutionarily outcompetes the democratic model. So if we care about that, it's actually also interesting in the last 2 months, I don't know if those who've been watching, but it's almost as if Xi Jinping saw the social dilemma. They've made sweeping tech regulations. They have made it so if you're under 14 years old, when you use TikTok, you swipe and you get museum exhibits, science experiments you can do at home, patriotism videos, things like that. They do, after a few videos, they do a mandatory 5-second delay, reminding you to stand up and do something else. They actually have opening hours and closing hours. So from 10 p.m. to 6 in the morning, it's closed. One of the problems of social media is actually the problem of social ostracization or social pressure. If I don't keep using it and my friends are, so I'm the one kid who's trying to go to bed at midnight, but my friends keep chatting and bullying until 2 in the morning and they're commenting on my photo. And if I don't respond, then something's going to happen to me. That creates a race condition for basically who goes to bed latest. That situation is managed when you say, hey, opening hours and closing hours. Now, I'm not, even though I sound like I'm praising what China's doing, I'm just noting that they are responding to the crisis and they're responding very quickly and swiftly. We don't want to do that because we don't want to have the dystopian values that are guiding authoritarian, like what we want to do. But if we actually have to answer this problem, and they are and we are not. And again, currently I wouldn't say all of our big tech companies, I would say the ones that profit from the degradation of democracy, which is currently, especially the Facebook, Twitter, TikTok model, are weakening us in the face of China. So if we want, I care about this too. Actually, a big motivation for our work is how do we actually create a new kind of democracy where technology plus democracy equals a stronger democracy. And the best example of that is Audrey Tang's work in Taiwan. And I would point everyone to her work. We did a podcast episode with her as well. And I think that's actually what we should be pointing to is how do we basically tame the monster, limit the whole engagement machine down to its minimal safe form while we build up, some people are calling it PBS for the internet, the Eli Pariser, Karen Kornblue, German Marshall Fund kind of model of a Taiwan for the US. Biden could even invite Audrey Tang here to the US to run it.
So let's, I want to focus, and I think we have time for everybody to contribute to this last question. It's not as ambitious Tristan, as what you've just described. And obviously, that's an exciting ambition. But I'm pushed by Nate a little bit to think about like what is the next 3-year type of solution that's possible. And what triggers this question is recognizing Facebook, I think today, maybe yesterday, announced a new policy for advertising where they will no longer enable ads triggered on what you could think of as controversial categories, whether it's identity categories or political categories, and to disable that as a dimension through which you can discriminate for advertising because they acknowledge that they've seen the way this is divisive. And that, I think, is a nice background to this question. How important is diversity and inclusion to social media and democracy? Is there a way in which the platforms were enabling a kind of diversity that maybe was destructive diversity? Or is the platform, by enabling a certain kind of diversity, destroying the potential for inclusion? So that's an essay question invitation for any of you. I think, Jamel, you're next on the list. Why don't you start with that?
So a nice, easy softball to finish things off. Is diversity and inclusion important to democracy? Certainly, diversity and inclusion is at the heart of democracy, insofar as democracy is a mechanism for resolving problems of pluralism. But it's not a free-for-all mechanism for resolving problems of pluralism. To Nate's point about Citizens United, right? That democracy is not coextensive with just allowing whoever is best able to grab the microphone to do so as loudly as possible. So long as everyone has their shot at trying to grab the microphone, we're good, right? That's not an effective or functional democracy. Right? So you need to have some rules, right? And those rules have to be attentive to what the particular dangers are within the context in which you're operating, right? And if we think some of those dangers are that those who are able to go viral, who are incentivized to do so, who are most opportunistic on the media ecosystem are not in fact particularly diverse, or don't in fact reflect pluralism, then that's, I think, a genuine problem that sophisticated democracies should be trying very hard to respond to.
Nate?
Well, let me pick up where Tristan left off a little bit in thinking about the Taiwanese model, because I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about that also. And what are the obstacles in the US toward going in that direction? Part of the problem, I mean, this is sort of the chicken and egg problem of internet regulation, which is that if only we trusted some outside independent body to monitor the internet, right, or to monitor these companies, it's like, oh, well, then we would be able to execute on all kinds of things. And so, for example, in Taiwan, they've got a great sort of system of dealing with disinformation by they hire full-time comedians that distract people away from some polarizing content and disinformation. But can you imagine, whether it's the Biden or Trump White House doing something like that? Also, on the point about diversity and inclusion, I'll agree with Jamel. I do worry that to some extent the way that we talk about the social media platforms assumes that everybody has a social media feed like us. But for most people, right, their social media feed is 3 to 5% politics, right? And so the problem, I think this is where the research has sort of gone in the last few years. The problem that people are finding, and you can see some of the work at the Stanford Internet Observatory on this, is the role that something like Facebook groups is playing, or the fact that people are gravitating to these corners of the internet by choice. Not that they're being pushed there necessarily by algorithms, though in some cases they are, and Frances Haugen's documents explain that. But a lot of this is that the same types of affordances that allow, a gay kid in Idaho to find someone, of common, sort of common purpose outside of their immediate vicinity is the same problem that's leading to, January 6th type organization, as well as some of the hate speech and other kinds of disinformation that we've been talking about.
Tristan, you got to close us off in negative 20 seconds.
Well, actually, just to counter a little bit of what, or push back a little bit on what Nate was saying, in Francis's files, one of the issues is that because Facebook's optimizing for growth, not safety, they actually allow, when they do a group invitation, so a person in a QAnon group could invite 300,000 people to that group. You would think in a regular world, a person would have to say, I want to accept that invitation to join that group before I see any of that content in my feed. Because Facebook's optimizing for engagement, meaning the maximum reactivity, and it was running low on people's organically posted content from their own mind, they said, we need to drop more groups content into people's feeds. And so they turned it so if you just got invited into a group, it started populating your feed with content from QAnon. For the top 15 pages targeting Christian Americans in October 2019, all of top 15 were run by Russian troll farms, and 85% of those pages were not actually, again, approved, like the users didn't actually accept the join from those groups. It was because it was, again, Facebook aggressively pushing that engagement stuff in there. I can give you other examples, but just want to say, I think the situation is much more dire and calls for much more radical action than typically is common in I think, the space of solutions that are comfortable for us. And I think the question is, how do we get to maybe comfort with a more radical set of actions? And I agree with Nate how difficult it is, given the fact that trust itself is actually one of the externalities of the Facebook polarization machine that decreases trust in our institutions the longer that we wait. So maybe that's a good place to stop.
Jamal, Nate, and Tristan, thank you so much. I'm grateful for your participation in this panel and for the questions that we got. For the students at HLS, if you go to the chat, you can see a link where you can follow into a group discussion about, or panel discussions about the topics we've been talking about. But for everybody else, thank you so much for tuning in, and stay tuned in this series for the next, and I should have known this, Ruth, I'm sorry. But we have if you sign up, you will be notified about what the next in the democracy series is. Thank you again for joining, and thanks to the panelists for coming.